Trillium and Ivy by ShastaFirecracker. Chapter 1. This was not the job Nicholas D. Wolfwood thought he would be starting on a beautiful summer morning 1 week after his 33rd birthday. But then again, he's never once held a job that he felt like he belonged in, so nothing new. The fish-out-of-water feeling was particularly strong as he walked into his new office, arms occupied with boxes, heavy book bags slung over his shoulder and thumping into his back. The director's office was a nice one, certainly nicer than any place he'd ever worked in before. There was a heavy, broad desk, one plush office chair behind it, and 2 sedate armchairs on the other side. Under a tall, curtained window was a love seat with a small table at each end, already equipped with an open box of tissues. He set his boxes down on the love seat and unslung his satchel to drop next to them, blowing out a long breath as he did so. Nick had never once felt qualified when starting a new job, but this might be the worst one yet. Funeral home director? He only had 6 months' experience as a mortician, half that time only as an assistant, and only 3 years of school before that, rather than the typical requisite 4. And not exactly a prestigious degree either, community college. But a job opening was a job opening, and his mentor in the coroner's office had flapped the newspaper ad in his face with such confidence and faith in his capacities that Nick had sent in a resume out of obligation. And for some ungodly reason, William Conrad III, Esquire, had offered him the job after one interview. Director of Services at Conrad Chapel Funeral Home. Sometimes Nick found his own charisma to be a curse. Okay, sure, he knew all the individual components of the work pretty comfortably. He didn't have to handle the finances. Conrad, who was primarily a tax attorney, ran the actual number-crunching business end of things. The Conrad in the name of the business had been his grandfather, and the youngest Bill hadn't wanted to sell the place, but also hadn't wanted to run it, so he was just the man who signed the payroll. Nick just had to run major expenses past him and not embezzle. Easily done. And Nick didn't have to build the place from the ground up. It already had a network of contacts, vendors, typical major clients. The hospital, the homeless shelter and rehab center downtown, the city's primary Catholic church. All Nick had to do was be friendly with the existing contacts, keep the wheels greased, keep business turning over as usual, handle some of the body prep, arrange burials with the cemeteries, keep the staff on task, talk to the bereaved, handle the logistics of death for people too deep in trauma to know which way was up. Be kind. Jesus Christ. Nick scrubbed his hands over his face, stomach churning on the black coffee and plain toast he'd had for breakfast. Okay. He could do it. He knew he looked the part. He hadn't even had to buy a new wardrobe, closet still half full of black suits from previous failures to find direction in life, let's say. The suit was pressed, the white shirt was crisp, his face was smooth, his hair was halfway to decent because he had tried okay, even though he knew it would be a mess again by the end of the day. And on top of all that, he had only smoked 1 cigarette this morning, before showering, thank you, and he smelled like inoffensive soap and toothpaste. He could not be more presentable if he tried. He slid his phone in his pocket and started unpacking. Small steps, simple things. Just do moment-to-moment tasks until it all feels real. The boxes were largely full of books and binders, his own notes from mortuary science classes and seminary, most of which he hadn't even opened since he'd left, but he still brought them with him. With hardly a glance, he tossed his own Bible in the top drawer of the desk, next to a stapler and some pens. It stayed with him like a safety blanket these days, not really an object of devotion. Textbooks on a shelf that already had several, including a duplicate of one he'd brought. Oops. One framed photo, only a 4x6-inch blurry snapshot developed from a roll of real film over 20 years ago in a CVS, paid for with Nick's allowance. He'd gotten the camera for his 11th birthday. It had been broken by his 12th, but that wasn't his own fault so much as the fault of living in a barely controlled house full of rowdy kids with minimal supervision and almost no way to have private belongings. And he'd only ever had half a dozen or so rolls of film in that year, because he had to buy them and then pay to develop them himself, so he was judicious with the shutter button. He'd never really gotten any good at photography. The photo was of a large Filipino woman, half washed out by bright morning light through a kitchen window. Her hands were deep in a bowl of something Nick knew to be rice she was rinsing, and she was in the process of turning to yell, something at the blurred figures in the foreground. Nick had wanted a picture of Miss Melanie working serenely in the kitchen, bathed in sunlight. Instead, he'd gotten a picture of Miss Melanie shouting at Davy and Eleanor not to run in the house, fight, or steal each other's toys. But her face wasn't angry. It's exactly as he remembers her, exasperated and worked up, but also endlessly entertained by her charges, struggling to bury a smile every time she needed to be stern. Even her yelling face has a half grin. Nick put the picture on his desk and looked at the window. The pale gray dawn light had brightened to full sunrise. He knew he got here too early, but he needed the chance to get used to the space. The rest of the regular staff should arrive soon. He met some of them in passing 2 weeks ago, when he was in and out of meetings with the former director, learning the ropes. Nick went over to the curtains and drew them back, curious about his office view. He was immediately greeted with an unimpressive expanse of road, parking lot, and an unattractive collection of dumpsters in the distance. He wrinkled his nose and started to pull the curtains shut again, understanding why the last director hadn't opened them, but some movement across the street made him stop. He couldn't find the movement again, but he took better stock of the view anyway. Outside the office window, there was an immediate row of hedges against the wall, then a few feet of grassy lawn, then sidewalk, then street, then parking lot. But he realized that the expanse of pavement was only about a third available for parking. The rest was blocked off by chain-link fencing and stacked pallets. It was easy enough to see inside the fence. Pallets piled high with brightly colored, flat bags of something, head-height stacks of what looked like giant bowls, a couple of awnings over bins full of— Nick couldn't make it out from here. And then, along the edges, a bunch of trees? Trees in pots? Garden center, Nick realized. Saplings, giant planters, bags of soil mixes. And there was a sign, not very eye-catching and hard to read from Nick's point of view. Savram Greenhouse and Landscaping. Interesting. Behind the chunk of parking lot marked off by fencing, there was a red brick building. Not much space for a greenhouse, Nick thought. Maybe it was on the other side. He couldn't see from here. He'd been in and out of Conrad Chapel a handful of times, but he'd kind of had blinders on at the time and hadn't really looked at the rest of the neighborhood. But he'd do well to know his business neighbors, for sure. The movement that had caught his eye originally returned again, and Nick realized it was a person. Tall, white man, leaving a side door of the red brick building and hurrying to a beat-up car parked on the curb. The tall man opened the trunk and hopped something up and onto his shoulder. It was big, looked heavy, maybe a piece of machinery, and used his free hand to slam the trunk closed. When he turned to go back to the door, Nick got a better look at him. God damn, Nick thought immediately, and then shushed the part of himself that wanted to woof-whistle inside his head. But really, god damn. It was due to be a hot summer day, and the bright blonde man was already dressed for it in a snug black shirt, loose jeans covered in smudges, and work boots. He looked thin from here, but Nick could tell it was a strong, muscled sort of thin. Svelte, one might say. Shit, stop drooling over the neighbors. Nick twitched the curtain closed and shook his head. Too early in the morning for this. He knew there was a small staff kitchen in the building, and wondered if he should make a pot of coffee before people started showing up, or if that would be overly ingratiating. It ended up being out of his hands anyway. As soon as he walked out of his new office, the front door down the hallway clunked open, and 2 chatting people walked in. A square-jawed man with an overly gelled bouffant, which Nick privately thought was both daring and absolutely absurd looking, and a shorter woman with brown braids that made her look like an outsized kindergartner. They stopped when they saw him. The girl waved brightly, grinning, and the man gave a jerky nod. Good morning, Nick said, clearing his throat and walking toward them. I remember you. Jessica, right? He held out his hand. That's me. She shook. Firm grip, self-assured. Secretary? Front desk, she corrected. I guess it's all semantics, but... No, that's... I want to know I'm getting it right. She smiled. How long have you been in? Not long, said Nick. Half an hour, maybe. Sorry, I know we've already met, but I had a lot to take in, and then with a week away... He looked over at the man, held out his hand. Nicholas Wolfwood. Brad Willingham, said Bouffant. He had a lighter voice than Nick had anticipated, not the sort of gruff growl he looked like he'd give off. I'm here for the general running around bodyman stuff, and I do embalming when I need to, but usually there's a contract guy who comes in the evenings. Gotcha. We're pretty much it for in-house, right? Nick asked. Except for our driver, said Jessica. He's pretty new, too, only been here a month, but I like him. Brad's brow furrowed in a way Nick couldn't quite parse. Didn't like the driver, then? Maybe something for Nick to watch out for. Well, call me Nick, said Nick. I was just about to start some coffee, unless... I make the coffee, said Brad. He stepped in around Nick and headed down the hallway. Nick raised his hands in mock surrender. Okay, then. Jessica laughed, and Nick was able to smile with her. The funeral home was set up more or less like a house, with a foyer sort of space near the front door and a hallway leading back from there into the sectioned-off viewing rooms, the conference room, the kitchen, and the director's office. Jessica went immediately to the desk in the foyer, setting her bag down and shuffling some things around on the desktop. It was obviously her personal space. How long have you worked here? Nick asked, following at a respectful distance, hands in pockets. Oh, probably 5 years now, Jessica said, looking up. Brad's been here the longest now that Mr. Chappell's retired. Brad and I went to high school together, if you can believe it. Not the same year, 3 years apart. But he came to work for Mr. Chappell right out of high school, and I had to go and get a teaching degree I didn't end up using. She laughed. She seemed like the type to laugh at the end of every sentence. Nick couldn't help liking her already. She seemed like she'd be easy to get along with. I thought I'd just do this until I got on my feet, but I really ended up liking it. Mr. Chappell was so nice to work for. She paused and seemed to realize what she'd said. Oh, but I'm sure you will be too. She looked him up and down. I like your suit, she said, clearly trying to recover. Nick chuckled. Thanks, he said, glancing down at himself. So, Brad's on coffee duty. Is that an all-the-time thing? Oh, God, yes, said Jessica. The kitchen is his territory. He loves to cook. Not that he cooks a lot here, because it's a little weird for a funeral home to smell like food. Nick made a maybe not face. He could imagine that a good comfort food smell might go over well for some people. But sometimes he'll bake, because it's like how realtors will bake some cookies in a house they're about to show. It can put people at ease. Nick's eyebrow went up. He was glad he was already on the same page with these folks. Smart, he said. And duly noted. I'll keep out of the kitchen. I tend to just live on cup noodles anyway. Jessica said, Oh no, that won't last long. If Brad likes you, he'll start to feed you. But don't let on that I already gave him away like that. She giggled. You'll get used to him. He'll act like a brick wall, but he's a big softy, really. I think the new driver's kind of the same. Who's? Coffee's up, came Brad's voice from down the hall, and at the same moment, the phone at the front desk rang. Jessica sat down immediately, pulled over a notepad and clicked open a pen, and answered. Conrad Chapel Funeral Home, this is Jessica speaking. Nick waved her a polite goodbye and headed down the hall toward the smell of fresh coffee. Ultimately, Nick Wolfwood's first morning as a funeral director went as well as he could possibly have hoped for. Nothing crazy came out of the woodwork. The only clients to handle were typical cases of elderly folks passing away of natural causes, and no family members who called were overly distraught. Nick quickly picked up that the system of the day was going to be pretty much just hear the phone ring, get past a memo from Jessica soon thereafter, start a file of paperwork, make about half a dozen phone calls just to get the paperwork started, then hear the phone ring again and start all over. He talked to several doctors, a coroner, 3 different grandchildren, and a casket vendor before lunch. He felt like he'd never stopped talking. But immediately, he could see that he and Brad and Jessica were going to get along just fine. Because Brad and Jessica already knew their jobs so well, Nick didn't have to direct them at all. In fact, he let them direct him. He had no interest in getting his handprints all over everything just yet. No reason to fix a system that wasn't broken. Every time he talked to a new person, he could go out front and ask Jessica if she knew them, and 9 times out of 10, she did. She caught him up on all kinds of personal dramas happening with vendors and contractors, priests and medical personnel. The structure of any given day seemed to revolve around office work in the morning, and the morgue typically wasn't even mentioned until after lunch. There was a lull around noon, long enough for Jessica to grab some food. Brad was out front on the phone with the driver, whose name Nick still hadn't caught. Nick joined Jessica in the kitchen to microwave some noodles. He'd brought his own chopsticks, not sure if there would be any in the kitchen. There weren't. And Jessica was the typical sort of white person wowed by his dexterity with them. Well, that was unkind of him, he told himself. She was just being nice, like everyone was. So, I'm not going to ask where you're from, Jessica said, digging into her brought-from-home salad. Because that's terrible, I know. Nick laughed obligingly. December, he said. Oh, she chewed a mouthful. I went on vacation there as a kid. Beautiful waterfall. Yeah, he said. And, to relieve her of her unasked question, he said, My mom was Korean-American, Dad was Indian. He knows this from files and pictures, not from knowing them personally, but he'll keep that in his pocket for now. People often wonder why he's so dark, but also monolithed. He's gotten used to giving the answer by rote. Oh, okay, she says. I mean, not that it really matters, but Livia was half Japanese. I wonder if I should get some chopsticks for the kitchen, actually. She looked around, vaguely fretful. I didn't even think of that. Nick shrugged a shoulder. It's no big deal. I've got a drawer full at home. I'll just leave some here. Who's Livio? The name tickled the back of his mind, particularly with the race descriptor. Oh, right, Jessica beamed. The new driver. He'll be here soon, I'm sure. He usually doesn't come in until the afternoons, unless there are specific runs to make. Livio, Nick thought. Mixed Japanese kid named Livio. Yeah, he remembered one. And how many of those could there be? but it was absolutely crazy to think this was the same one. Really just a wild coincidence. Nick almost started to tell Jessica right then and there that she wouldn't believe this. Haha, isn't it wild? But once upon a time, Nick had lived for almost a year with a kid named Livia whose dead dad had been Japanese. But something stopped him. He scarfed his noodles and furrowed his brow, thinking. He was in desperate need of a smoke. I'm going out back for a few minutes, he told Jessica, who waved him off cheerfully. There was a fire exit back door, and then there was the door to the parking area for the hearse and collection van. Since fire exits tended to set off alarms, and Nick wasn't sure if this one would or not, he went out the parking zone. He pulled out a cigarette and fished his lighter out of his jacket pocket, wandering around the little area curiously. Room for 2 cars and enough space for unloading large cargo. The hearse was in its spot, gleaming black, but the other spot was empty. There was a side door to a storage closet with cleaning supplies, tarps and things, and a panel by the entry door with a buzzer button and speaker grill. Late-night deliveries, Nick supposed. People didn't die on a business day schedule. He'd already learned from his predecessor that the contract embalmer and cosmetician tended to work nights. Nick pulled the sweet, sweet nicotine into his lungs and wandered around the side of the parking area. This put him on the same side of the building as his office window. He looked out across the parking lot to the garden center. The parts of the pavement actually available for cars were all full, and the garden center seemed to be doing gangbusters. Nick smiled a little. Good for them, this little mom-and-pop joint that seemed to be capable of competing in a town with multiple big-box stores with corporate garden centers attached to their sides like tumors. That word landscaping probably had a lot to do with it. No one wanted Walmart to landscape their yard. But Joe Smith from the same church they went to? Yeah, absolutely. Among the bustle, a figure caught Nick's eye. Same guy from before, now with a red plaid overshirt on top of his black shirt. Odd to add a layer as the day got warmer, but maybe the store interior was really air-conditioned or something. He was pushing a flatbed cart loaded with soil and mulch bags for a little old woman who was walking next to him, talking animatedly. He was smiling and laughing and chatting back. Nick found himself really wishing he could make out the man's voice, but it was way too far away. The blond man loaded bags into the bed of the little old lady's small pickup truck, paused to talk with her a little longer. Nick thought, asking how the hell she's going to unload that when she gets home, because hell if I know, and then bent down to give the lady a quick one-arm hug before she turned to get in the car. Wow, Nick thought. Either amazing customer service, or the lady was actually this guy's grandma or something. Nick finished his cigarette just as the blond man turned to head back to his business. As his gaze passed across the street, taking in the general sight of the world, his eyes landed on Nick, who suddenly realized that he was standing in the shadow of a funeral home's hearse carport, wearing all black, smoking, and staring like an absolute creep. Nick hurriedly pinched the cig out, bad old habit that stung his fingers, and raised his hand in a polite little wave. Blond man waved back. Just a little thing, and it was hard to tell across the distance, but Nick thought the guy had smiled as well. Then the moment passed, and the blond man walked away, and Nick released the breath he didn't realize he'd held for a few beats too long. You need to get laid, Nick muttered to himself, parroting one of his coworkers at his last job. And it was probably true, but it was a cheap substitute for the more accurate sentiment, which was that Nick needed to get a life. Friends. A hobby. Go to a movie or something. Shit. Sighing, Nick turned to go back inside. Right then, a nearby engine made itself heard, and he turned back just in time to see the collection van approaching. He stepped backwards out of its parking spot and watched it pull in, noting the sedate lettering on the side that stated its business. He wondered if there was cargo or not. When the driver's side door opened, Nick started to walk around the hood of the van to see the guy. Need a hand unloading? He asked. No, back's empty, said the driver, and then Nick rounded the corner and saw him face to face. The van might as well have hit him at full speed. Nick stared, jaw going a little slack as he tried to square the circle in front of him. He might be 3 times as tall and 4 times as heavy, and his hair might be going premature gray, but Nick recognized fucking Livio Crybaby Harada in a heartbeat. Holy shit, said Nick. Livio squinted, obviously uncertain, but not oblivious. Do I know? Melanie, Nick said. Wait, said Livio. Remember when Jasmine fell off the roof? Wait, what the hell? Livio said, eyes widening. Nico? Just Nick, said Nick, breaking into a huge grin. He strode forward and Livio met him, arms that could probably snap Nick in half with a hard enough squeeze going around his shoulders in an immediate bear hug. Livio was laughing. What the fuck, man? Livio said. Why are you asking me? Nick said, his diction, as always, getting sloppy when he didn't pay attention. How long you been here? What, here? Or May? I don't know, Nick said, stepping back and looking at Livio from arm's length. Everything. Everywhere. Haven't seen you since you were... He held a hand to his own knee. Livio laughed. What are you doing here? He looked around the small carport, realizing where they were. Said Nick. I think I'm your boss. Excuse me? Nick waved his hands at himself. Yeah, meet the new director of CC. No shit. Livio's eyes were wide. Okay, I have to know how this happened. It's been 20 years. What are the chances? Brad opened the back door and called. Livio, you coming in, or do you... Oh, hey. He blinked at both of them. Oh, Nick said. Work. Right. Is there a call? Yeah, Brad said. Pick up at the hospital. Okay, Livio said at once. He glanced at Nick. You want to ride along? Nick looked back and forth to Brad. I mean, I should meet people at the hospital, yeah? Shake hands and make nice? You and Jess got it for a while? Brad's eyelid twitched at the name Jess, but he nodded. Sure, he said. Go get the lay of the land. Livio blurted to Brad. We knew each other as kids. Brad blinked. Pardon? Yeah, we were in the same... Heart suddenly leaping, Nick cut in to say, Town, yeah, neighborhood even. Small world, isn't it? I guess we've got a ton to catch up on. Just remember there's a job to do, Brad said, a little sullenly, but he waved them goodbye and went back in the building. Nick climbed into the passenger seat, Livio the driver's side. Nick had a chance to take stock of him. Livio was wearing a plain button-down, brown dungarees and boots, and suspenders, all over an obvious mountain of muscle. It was certainly a look. Nick couldn't help wondering if he was into bodybuilding or something. Once they were both buckled in, Livio paused with his hands on the steering wheel, engine cranked but idling. Same town, huh? He asked, brow drawn in. Nick's stomach sank. Nah, it's... He sighed. I've literally known them for about 5 hours is all. There's a lot going on. New job, power dynamics, stuff like that. It just hasn't come up. Livio shrugged with one shoulder and pulled out of the space, looking back through the rear view. Yeah, I get it. But I have kind of talked about my background with them, so they're probably going to twig to same neighborhood being bullshit. Sorry. Said Nick, rubbing the bridge of his nose. It's fine. I don't really hide anything on purpose, anyway. Good, said Livio. Cool. So what's been going on with you? At the end of 2 weeks, Nicholas D. Wolfwood, orphan, dropout, failed priest, failed social worker, and several times failed boyfriend, felt like he might, weirdly enough, be cut out to be successful as a funeral home director. Definitely not where he'd ever seen his life going, but when had he ever seen where his life was headed? It just seemed to keep rolling along under his feet, and mostly he spent his time trying to keep up and falling on his face instead. But now, for once, he felt like his feet were pretty firm on the ground, and it felt good. He was up to speed on all sorts of things. Brad's crush on Jessica, Jessica's crush on some unknown third party she wouldn't name, blushing dark pink and shaking her head whenever it was brought up. How Ravi, the nighttime embalmer's degree in creative writing, was coming along. Livio's colorful but brief military career post-orphanage, and his honorable discharge post-hospital stay. He hadn't said exactly what he'd been in the hospital for, but Nick would give it time and not push. And he'd gone ahead and bit the bullet himself, telling Jessica and Brad, and Ravi, since he ended up seeing the man pretty often, that Nick and Livio had not been neighbors but rather bunkmates, arguably even brothers, at St. Michael's Children's Home in December. It felt good to be open about most anything he felt like talking about. He kept himself reined in around clients, obviously, but he learned early on that mild cursing did not offend any of his regular office mates. Jessica was far worse than Brad for dropping shit, hell, and damn. Livio had a much fouler mouth on him, but he kept the real jarhead stuff to the privacy of the van. Nick went on ride-alongs as often as he reasonably could without sacrificing anything he needed to get done in the office. He'd only been bunkmates with that weepy, weedy little kid named Livio for a year, but a year had been enough. Talking with the man Livio had become just sent Nick screaming backwards through time to relive some of the best moments of a childhood without too much good in it, all told. And the Livio of today was pretty great to get to know. Rude but funny, straightforward as a self-defense mechanism because he struggled to understand social cues, loud to laugh, and quick to grin. He liked cowboy stuff and wished big hats and cool capes would make a comeback. Nick laughed himself sick at the idea of a decked-out Livio in Wild West gear. Nick was the only smoker of the bunch, though, so his moments of privacy throughout the day were often in the form of 10 minutes at a time outside the back door in the shade of the carport. He brought an ashtray from home to leave in the supply closet, and he did the best he could to keep the smoke from clinging to his suits. No one complained that he stank of cigarettes, so it was better than previous jobs at least. Probably helped that he'd been working hard on cutting down. His pack-a-day lifestyle had not been pleasant for anyone, least of all him. He wasn't sure he'd ever be able to quit, but he could at least try to poison himself more slowly. He spent his smoke breaks watching the garden center mostly, just people watching. There seemed to be several repeat customers, because he would spot the same cars more than once, but only the rust bucket belonging to Blondie was always there. A couple other vehicles had to belong to staff, though. A dinky silver Toyota sedan was there too often to be a customer, and a bicycle with a basket was almost always chained into the far right end of the bike rack. Nick always missed these people arriving or leaving. He was too busy. Say what you would about the funeral industry, but it always had a steady flow of customers. Every now and then he'd spot Blondie. Sometimes Blondie spotted him too, and waved cheerfully as he went about his business. He seemed to not be bothered by the creep in black at the funeral home who smoked out back like a delinquent teen. During the day, Blondie always had long sleeves on, even on the days that broke a 100-degree heat index. He didn't even roll them up. Nick was hung up on this little thing about him, especially because in the cooler mornings, if Nick was in the office early, he sometimes spotted Blondie walking from his car to the side door in short sleeves, hands in pockets. It was odd, that was all. And so the summer began.